Well, good morning. Good morning and welcome. It is 10 a.m. Singapore time on Monday, the 22nd of November. And why does that matter? Well, today was to be the day that we went live with the first day of our ISO transition period. We've been thinking over the last few weeks about lost in translation and how translation services for ISO impact the banks and their readiness to play in this new world of new message types that are rolling around the world as part of the ISO regulations. And today was to have been the day that it all started. So we're going to think about in today's session how that looks, how that would have looked, and how that looks now from an Asia perspective. So here we are with three special guests, Singapore focus and Asia focus this morning. This is 10 a.m. Singapore time. We're going to follow this up a little later in the day with 10 a.m. London time, where we'll think about it from a European perspective. And then we'll close out the day with 10 a.m. North America East Coast time and look at it with a lens on what does it mean for North America. So let's get into it. Singapore first, Asia time. I'd like to welcome three very special guests this morning, starting with Heng Hai Lim, who is an expert in all things ISO standardization in the finance sector for many years, with a specific focus on those APIs and those integration points, a man with great technical experience together with banking know-how over many years. Welcome. We're delighted to have you join us for this discussion today. My colleagues, that's great. Thanks, Heng Hai. My colleagues, Mike Truter, who is our man on the ground in Singapore and knows an awful lot about banking over many years. Mike's been part of these conversations over the last couple of months. Welcome back, Mike. And Julie, who is our head of payment strategy and is our model enthusiast for all things new, embracing new approaches, new technologies, new standards in the payments game. So welcome to all three of you. We're delighted to have you. So we've only got 15 minutes, so let's get into it. Heng Hai, I'm going to come to you for the first question. So today would have been the day that we started to receive these payments in the new SWIFT format. So it would have been high value payments. They would have been coming in across the SWIFT rails. And then there was an announcement to say it's going back 12 months. So what was the reaction of the Asian market to that delay? Was it received well? Was it a surprise? What were the thoughts when that happened?
Yep. So if you look at Asian market, I think the feeling has been mixed. Some of the banks is actually hoping that it actually happens, and some of the banks was actually quite relieved that there was actually a delay in the implementation. And working in the payment industry for many years, you will agree that there's never a right time. And looking at such a massive implementation across the world, where more than 10,000 banks is going to be involved, but definitely, most of the banks would actually be happy that is giving them a breather, primarily because of the COVID situations. A lot of banks are actually affected with a lot of new regulation and support operationally.
So some sense of relief, I guess. Yeah. So go on, Mike.
Yeah, I was going to say, Heng Hai, one of the things we have here in Asia, of course, is there's lots of different currencies, lots of different countries, lots of different variations between each country. And I think one of the big challenges that banks will face is that, each jurisdiction is doing their own thing at a different time in a different way. Some doing kind of big bangs, some doing, like for like, and then the transition. Just on that complexity thing, there also tends to be lots of variation. We saw that here, in Europe when SEPA happened, that there were variations in even the ISO standard, between countries in Europe. Do you think that same thing will happen? That same problem of these local variances. This is all about standardization, yet we may be moving a little bit away from achieving that harmonization.
Yeah, I think, Mike, you have touched on a very interesting point. And to be fair, the point has also been dealt with at the payment sec level. So the payment secs actually stand for the Payment Standard Evaluations Group. They meet on a monthly basis to actually look at global change requests required to the current ISO 200 payments related messages. So we are also very clear that that there needs to be a balance between standardizations, you are not going to get a full consistent message throughout the various countries. Looking at the 10 ASEAN country, for example, 10 country, 10 language, 10 different legal systems, there's going to be local variants that is required to support some of the local business rules. When we were doing the real-time payment system harmonization between Singapore and Thailand for the PromptPay and PayNow implementation, you'll be surprised that that there's very unique market practices that is uniquely relevant only to the Thais. So we are very clear that in any standardization movement, if we can get 80% of the messages with the common dictionary, common definition, and understanding of all those attributes, is really a very fantastic development. And the best example that I always tell my customers is that if you look at Singapore and Malaysia, we are actually very glad that almost 80% of the messages is identical. The 20% delta is usually associated with, for example, Islamic bankings. So this will be a common norms globally when you look at this ISO 222 implementations. And if you look at it from the central bank's infrastructures and the SWIFT implementation, definitely the banks will need to support two different branches. The business rules, the practices, and the payloads is going to have subtle differences.
And if I may, like, to be fair, I think this is a bit like, the difference that can be killing. And we saw it with the SEPA implementation, right? Where we went to harmonization in Europe to some extent. So in fact, like, the 80% harmonization to some extent was, as you mentioned, is like, I would say, relatively easy to reach. But then it's a 20% full harmonization that then, like, where you have all the complexity and you really need to think through of all these use cases before actually like declaring that you fully cover, I think.
Yeah, I mean the massive complexities across the different regions is really interesting, isn't it? And it's a different challenge for the Asia region that is certainly from Europe and North America, very different, real intricacies. So I guess, but of course we have already gone live in the Philippines, right? Hi. So some of the infrastructure is now ahead of the SWIFT deadlines. So how does that work? What does that mean?
Primarily, it's also the similar challenges, and it's as what I always tell my team and customers is that there's not going to be a perfect timing. Most likely, there's certain inherent business rule required. And if you look at some of these ISO 222 requirements for the ASEAN's economies, it can even go back as far as the ASEAN bond markets, whereby they were looking at how they can actually share some of the information across the ISO 222 definitions. So definitely there's some commitments and business rules associated with it, and they are going ahead with it. For Singapore side, if you look at it, the Mass Plus implementations is looking for a like for like implementation, so that most of the banks can actually reuse some of the components. So it's all about that regulatory push at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I was going to jump in if I may. So one of the things that we keep looking at, I think there's many approaches to moving to ISO. Obviously, fundamentally, one day, it'll be ISO native payment engines and so on that banks will need. But in the interim, most banks are going to kind of protect their core and keep the existing systems and probably implement translation services, which is kind of the thing that we're really thinking about in the series. But if there's lots of different flavors, those translations must be quite complex, for each domestic and each cross-border flow, especially if there are different requirements that, this message requires these additional fields or that one requires those. How are banks able to cope with this complexity? Because surely that must flow all the way from their channel, capturing the payment through to ultimately flowing through and hopefully not stopping for repair somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah. You're totally spot on, and a lot of banks that we have spoken to, they are really doing that translation layers primarily as such a massive implementation. And for us in payments for so long, you will understand that Asia implementation is also subjected to change. They are all trying to defer some of these changes, so that actually when the system is more stable, the business rule is clearer, then they will actually look at how they actually enhance their core, and that's where they will try to streamline and actually, sure, better word, harmonize and dissect some of the business rule and translation so that they actually can reuse more of the component. But this part of the transition is inevitable, and it's, to be very candid, it has been a very painful journey for the banks. And the primary challenge that I have is also with all this shifting of schedules, whereby you have different code merge, different product launch. Not to forget, there's also a huge push for central bank distributed digital currencies. A lot of them is also looking at how they can interoperate with some of these new fintech payment facilities. So timing it, when to merge it, actually with all these delays, they are trying as much to actually leverage on existing as possible, because they do not know the net impact until it's really out. And if we are familiar with Swift is doing their annual migrations and upgrades, and that's added a different dimension to the whole spectrums itself.
So yeah, exactly. So Julie, I was going to ask you, Julie, with your obviously keenly interested in these things, ahead in some ways, but other challenges, right? In the Asia.
Yeah, no, indeed. But one of the things I wanted to say effectively is, like, I think for me, like, it makes sense to protect your core banking system to, like, make sure you're compliant on time, right? But I think the key term in this sentence is, like, compliant per se. And I think the longer you protect your core banking and you try to stay away from ISO, then that means the longer you're gonna jump on the strategic wagon to some extent, and being in the position where actually you can leverage a new data model and recognize some more revenues out of, like, and trying to recover from all the costs related to the migration. So I think for me, like, yeah, it makes sense, but it's key to see that as, like, just a stepping stone to be then more strategic. Otherwise, the migration will be like just a new cost center that will probably bring bring revenue at all. So and yeah, I think for me this is one of the main challenge, like kind of switching mindset as well, and thinking long term and strategic as well, and don't stay too much on the tactical step.
Yeah, if I can add to that, one of the things that I always worries me, and I think we've seen it all over the place, is where banks approach this only as an IT change. It's just a messaging level change, right? And there's no business change at all that people feel is needed. But that's a real concern. And Heng Hai, do you think in Asia people treat it a bit too much like a technology project and just leave it to the vendor to solve, rather than something that really is fundamentally about changing how payments of the future works?
No, definitely. Okay, Singapore has been into ISO 200 since 2011. So I think most of the banks has actually migrated their payment infrastructures. But if you look around Singapore, country like Vietnam, country in the Mekong region, a lot of their infrastructure is still on the ISO 853s. They do not have any other real-time capability other than 853s, and that migration to ISO 222 is going to be a much steeper and much painful process for them. You look at it, they are still very used to the short transaction reference numbers, and when we were talking to them, I was alarmed that they are still not using even the latest 853. They are maybe on the 94 versions or 97 versions of the 853. So they are definitely in a major they are facing a lot of major changes required. And as what I mentioned earlier, they are deferring some of this. Primarily, if they can do that translation layers for that period of times until it's more stabilized. And it goes back to what Julia is saying, that they are treating this as a cost. They are not taking a strategic view on this, on how they actually can adopt these standards and make sure that their product is ready for some of these developed countries. They are not going to stay in their countries. A lot of countries is saturated, and there's ASEAN Banks concept whereby you want to expand your operations beyond your own territory. So that's are the challenges that they need to look hard at it and make that investment. It's a matter of time. They can run away from it.
So there's a lot to think about, isn't there? So we're pretty much out of time. We're at 15 minutes and a little bit. I knew this conversation could run, and it's been so great to do. So final question, Heng Hai, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thanks for that. Yeah,
you've got an extra year in Asia. Will the banks be ready?
You have gotten my answer from my last feedback. It goes back to the country itself. Actually, depending on how open the country is and whether the banks has been exposed into regional business, and if you want to go into that field, definitely you are more ready because you have prepared yourself. I have seen that in a lot of Thai banks. If you look at the Thai banks, they are doing a fantastic job getting a lot of overseas business. And you look at in terms of interconnectivity today, I'll say within ASEAN, PromptPay has been doing a fantastic job. But if you are looking at some of the banks that is still having a lot of infrastructure issues, they are going to need that extra bump, and that translation layer is going to be fundamental for them.
So I think your answer was yes, but there's complexities across different regions and there's a lot to do.
Right. Yeah, sorry for a long answer to a simple question.
It's a great answer. Well, thank you, Heng Hai. Terrific to see you again. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Julie, for this brief discussion. We could have gone on much longer than the allocated 15 minutes. But this was our 10 a.m. Singapore session. We will later on today have 10 a.m. London, where we'll be joined by Nazir Ahmed, who's head of the ISO program at SWIFT. That'll be an interesting conversation. Of course, it's these SWIFT changes that are driving this movement in the market. And then at 10 a.m. East Coast America time, we'll be joined by Kelly Johnson, who's head of payment strategy for the National Bank of Canada. And how does this all look from a North American perspective? So thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you again, Heng Hai, and to my guests and to all those watching. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye for now.